Imagine that you hear about a powerful new miracle drug just discovered by scientists. Now imagine you discover that the researcher who developed the drug had a conflict of interest. For example, they hold stock options in the drug maker and will make a lot of money if the drug gets approved. Would that affect how you think about the drug? Welcome to the Chicago Booth Review podcast, where we bring you groundbreaking academic research in a clear and straightforward way. I'm Hal Weitzman, and today I'm talking with Chicago Booth's Luigi Zingales about conflicts of interest in research. What's driving conflicts of interest in academic research, and what should be done about it? Luigi Zingales, welcome to the Chicago Booth Review podcast.
My pleasure.
We want to have you back because we're talking about conflict of interest, which of course is not a new idea at all, but it's a long-standing interest of yours, particularly in the sense of conflict of interest in academia. What first got you interested in that? Obviously, you're an academic, but why is it important for academics and for non-academics to worry about conflict of interest in academia?
So I think it's very important because many of us think that there is some form of capture of regulators, not because regulators are evil persons or they are corrupt, but because a combination of access to information and incentives end up pushing the regulators to be too kind and too interested in not the welfare of the regulated of the people, but the profitability of the regulated companies.
And that's something that George Stigler pointed out.
That is the idea that George Stigler first advanced in 1971 and has become now kind of a standard. And more than 10 years ago, I made this very simple observation. It's not very deep, but I think it's important, is if we take the same incentives, for example, access to information or career concerns, etc., academics might have the same distorted incentives as the regulators. With the only redeeming feature is that once we have tenure, we cannot lose our job. Regulators can lose a job, we can't. But in everything else, in some outside opportunities and research funders, access to data, etc., the incentives are the same. And so the risk of having a distortion is the same. Now, what is funny is I encounter an enormous amount of resistance. I wrote this paper more than 10 years ago. And I didn't even submit it to a journal because I was sure it would be rejected, so I buried it in a book. It's probably my least cited publication ever. And it's one of my actually preferred ones. And what is ironic is when you talk to economists, most of them, of course there are notable exceptions, but most of them don't recognize that's even a problem, at least when you talk directly. And they say that, of course, they are searching the truth and they are independent and all. And I actually find it very funny because if you're a doctor, I think maybe you don't believe in incentives or you think that what motivated you to enter medicine was a higher calling. But if you're an economist, how can you believe that incentives work for everybody else except for economists? It seems like a bit ironic.
But you were telling economists that they might be partial, they might be compromised, and they didn't.
I think he's recognizing we're human being. I don't think that exactly like the regulator. I don't think the regulator are bad human beings. In fact, most of them are very nice people who try to do their best. In spite of that, they end up being captured. Okay, so it's not. I don't put any moral element to it. I just trying to look at the evidence, and we know that in medicine, no matter how honest them doctors are, if your drug research has been sponsored by the company producing the drugs, the chances that the results are more favorable to the drugs are significantly higher. Right. So I don't think that that's something that should be surprising. What is surprising is the attempt to deny this, because it seems like denying gravity.
And the economists were saying to you, well, the doctors can be biased, but we obviously are objective.
Exactly. It's like if a physicist saying that gravity works for everybody else, except for physicists. It's like, it doesn't make any sense.
But just to dig into that for a second, so, scientists would say we just led by the data. So if that's the case, how could there be any bias in the way you're talking about? Is it just that the experiments are designed to lead to a certain outcome?
First of all, we know that in most experiments there are so many arbitrary choices that can lead to a particular, can influence the result. But even more important is the access to the data is crucial. And certain research is not done because there is no access to the data. And only some research can be done because there is access to the data. And particularly the private sector is very smart at granting access to data to people who only look for stuff that is in their interest they find. And so I'm not necessarily saying there are two kind of distortions. There is a distortion of, I design a study so that maybe inadvertently, because as a result, they're more likely to be significant. But to me, the biggest problem is the dog that didn't bark, is that that research that is not produced. And so you get bombarded with all this evidence, but you don't have the evidence on the other way around, on the other side. And you don't have the other on the other side, not because it doesn't exist, it's because you could not possibly gather it.
But you're suggesting when you call it conflict of interest that there is maybe not a conscious choice, but there's a direction that the researcher is taking it in, which says, I'm not going to cover that, but I am going to cover that. Or I'm not going to seek data to find that. I'm going to seek data to prove this.
Yeah, I think that it could be either conscious or subconscious. I cannot tell. But imagine that I'm a company, and I give you access to my data to write a paper, and my data are super interesting. So you know that if you keep writing papers with my data, you get tenure easily, okay? But you also know that I have an interest, and that if you write something that annoys me, I can stop the granting of the data tomorrow. And as a result, you don't get tenure. Don't you think that you're going to internalize this?
Absolutely. Well, not me personally, but obviously everybody else. So
if you're an economist, you should. If not, you're violating.
Well, I'm being like an economist saying everybody else is biased, but not me, Luigi. That's what I'm saying. Okay, so and there's another track of your research over the years, which is about measuring trust. Tell us about that and how that sort of informs this work.
So I think that is very important because the information is diffused by people, and people receive that information and incorporate that information only if they trust that information. And so the element of trust is very, very important, and develops slowly over time, and is not easy to change overnight. I always tell the story that I was impressed when I was a young immigrant in this country. I was living in Boston, and I faced the first hurricane warning. Okay, it's rare that there are hurricanes in Boston, but occasionally there are. And I think in 1989 there was one, and so the mayor announced that everybody had to go inside their house and tape their windows. And to my surprise, everybody in Boston was doing precisely that. As an Italian, if the mayor tells you to stay inside, you certainly stay outside, because he said there is a reason why you want inside, so you had to stay outside. And if they say that you have to tape the windows, the first thing you think about is that his brother is selling tapes, and so he's trying to get you to buy it. And so I greatly admire this ability of Americans to trust, and I realized that part of it was the result of institutions that were more by the people, of the people, and for the people than in the Italian tradition. If you have a tradition of governments that don't work in your interest, you develop a mistrust that is very, very difficult to undo.
Okay, and so this research is about the kind of confluence of those two things, the conflict of interest and trust, or lack of it, and you get something called the conflict of interest discount. What's that?
As a researcher, we are in the production of ideas. And, the ideas have two elements, how novel they are, but also how trustworthy they are. And so in this paper, I try to figure out to what extent the conflict of interest you have might undermine the trustworthiness of your ideas. As you know better than I, in the last few years, there is a lot of mistrust toward experts. And a lot of people say, is because people don't understand, or etc. I am of a slightly different view. Is maybe people do understand, they just don't know how to articulate. And so maybe the mistrust they receive is because they realize that a lot of research is conflicted, and they start to discount. So I was trying to figure out how big of a problem this is.
Okay, and so the discount is just that I know there's a conflict of interest. I mean, how does it actually work?
Actually, if you want to be technical, is that the value of a paper is the extent in which this paper changes my prior. So I read a paper that says that cutting taxes stimulates GDP, okay? I come into that with a certain prior, I read the paper, and I develop a posterior. The difference between what I come in, my prior, and what I get out posterior, that's the value of the paper, okay? That's how much I trust that paper.
I see. And so that's discounted. There's less trust if I find out, Luigi was actually receiving money from the drug company.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I change my prior less, and so the value of the paper is less. So we're measuring how much less valuable is conflicted research. This is very important because a lot of the attempts to deal with conflicted research is disclosure, disclosure, disclosure. Now, disclosure is important. However, it doesn't really address the problem that the research is less valuable. What we need to do is discount this research every time we use the research. So if I am doing a literature review, and imagine there are 5 papers saying one thing and 5 papers saying the opposite, but if the 5 papers saying the opposite, they're all conflicted, is as if there were only 2.5 papers. Or in front of a jury, we treat all the papers the same, but they're not the same. And what I said, generating a lot of panic among assistant professors, I said, even in a phase of review, we promote people based on the not just the number, but a number of top publications is important. However, if all these top publications are conflicted, they should be counted less, not counted 0, but not counted 1.
Right, and actually you quantified it, right, that on average, a conflict of interest decreases trust in an economics paper by 30%. So how do you explain that?
Oh, this is a little bit more complicated because you have to go from the reduction in trust to the discounting value, okay? So the reduction in trust is simply we ask somebody, and we ask normal human beings in a random sample, but also academic economists.
Who are not normal human beings.
We're not normal human beings by any stretch of the imagination. We ask them first, you read this paper, how much do you trust this paper? And then we say, oh, by the way, now you're told that the footnote reads that this guy received the data, was paid, was ideologically connected. We treat it in different ways. How much less you trust, or how much more, depending on the situation, you trust this paper. That's the difference in trust. Okay? However, when we ask generically, because we do repeated question, always in the context of a survey on conflict of interest. So people are very salient the fact that there might be a conflict of interest, even when we tell them there is this paper without the conflict. Okay? So in order to go to the reduction in the prior, we need to factor in what was the probability, the attribute that the paper was conflicted before we sort of told them that there was a conflict, okay? And so we go through the AER, the American Economic Review, and then as a control, we also use the RAND journal to try to figure out how many conflicted papers there are. And on average, 40% of the AER paper are conflicted and 30% of the RAND. Now, we don't know whether this is because there are fewer conflicted papers in the RAND or because the AER has better disclosure rules. But the difference is huge between theory papers. Not very many theory papers are conflicted. A lot of empirical papers, for one reason or another, are conflicted. So, and of course, the source of the conflict is very different. So, and not all the conflicts are the same. But this is a generalized problem. It's not some or generalized issue. I wouldn't even say is a problem as long as people understand and put the right discounts.
Right, Luigi, in the first half we talked about this conflict of interest and the effect that it has on people's trust in academic research, and it's pretty widespread, it sounds like. So you've identified lots of different ways in which you can be conflicted: financial, professional, ideological, data access, academic. Which of those leads to the biggest discount?
The biggest discount is for data access, particularly if you don't explicitly say that the data provider does not have a right of review the paper. Okay? Now, technically, if you do things properly and you go through the counsel office of the University of Chicago, you're not allowed to even engage in a situation in which the
they can sign off on the research.
Exactly, right? Because that's the ultimate version of propaganda, right? If you sign off the research. However, number one, there are papers in the AER that says explicitly that they did have this condition. So not everybody follows this rule, number one. Number two, I know as a fact, but it's not disclosed, that every paper that exits any of the Federal Reserve system is subject to a screening, okay? And as usual, as I told you earlier, it's very rare that paper gets rejected because people are rational and avoid topics that will create this. But there is a particular paper, famous paper by, I think, John Vickers, if I'm not mistaken, at the Federal Reserve of New York, the paper studied LIBOR before the LIBOR scandal and was not allowed to release the paper. So in some situation, it is binding. And I think that the first step should be that journals refuse to accept papers in this situation. And then people said, but then we will not have any paper from the Federal Reserve employees. Said, no. Simply the Federal Reserve would change the rules because we'll not be able to...
They want them to get published, right? Absolutely.
Exactly. So I think that we need a little bit of coordination. And to be fair, economics has done an enormous progress in the last 10 years, because in the past, nothing was disclosed and the conflict were flagrant. So I think that we are in the right direction, but there is a lot of steps to be done. The second, in my view, would be to have more serious data intermediaries that collect data and distribute data, making less clear this quid pro quo that is implicit in every proprietary data access.
It's like an escrow account for data.
Kind of,
you
yes.
lock the data and then somebody else comes and blindly takes it out.
Then in a piece of Pro Market a few years back, I actually made the following proposal and say, if I can make a legitimate claim that there might be a problem in a company, and the company has the data and does not show me that the problem doesn't exist, we should safely assume the problem is there.
Wow, okay.
And why did I say that? Because a former colleague of mine, and actually co-author in this paper, that's a reason why, many years ago, wrote a paper about Uber, okay? And I know this guy was super honest because his motivation was, every time I go out in the evening and I'm overserved, I get an Uber instead of driving back. So it must be that Uber reduced fatalities. So he went and tried to search whether the data confirmed this idea that when a ride-sharing service, of course, not just Uber, there's also Lyft, but when a ride-sharing service enters a town, you would expect fatalities to go down. He found the opposite. Okay? He found the opposite, and at the beginning he was very puzzled. Why find the opposite? And so he spent an enormous amount of time trying to understand. And then the answer was actually trivial, ex post. Those are the best papers when very hard ex ante, but trivial ex post, which is most people don't substitute Uber for their car, or at least not most. A significant fraction of people substitute public transportation for Uber. And certainly very few people go on Uber share. So the impact of Uber is to increase the number of cars in circulation. And we know that there is a direct relationship between car in circulation and fatalities. So it's pretty obvious that you have an increase in fatalities. Now, he had an extremely hard time publishing that paper. Basically, it was rejected by every major economic journal and ended up in some operation journal, et cetera, et cetera. And part of the reason is that he did not have the perfect identification. Okay? Why? Because he was relying on this indirect measure of a ride-sharing service entering a town, which can be correlated with a lot of things, instead of having the precise data of Uber. So when he was struggling with Uber, I actually wrote an article on ProMarket saying it's incumbent on Uber to give him the data, because if they know that their data are good, I think that why don't share them, right? And if they don't want to share, we know
Sounds a bit like making an accusation and then saying, if I'm wrong, then you
No, it's not making an accusation. This is based on data. This was serious work. Using the best publicly available data that was establishing a very important fact, okay? And so they had the data to disprove the fact. After a year, they didn't disprove the fact, and so I introduced what I call the Sherlock Holmes principle, that like the dog that didn't bark, you assume the dog was not there. The same thing for Uber.
Okay. So I'm interested when you talk about this conflict of interest discount, and sometimes it comes from financial reasons, right? Consulting fees or research grants. Does the amount of the grant, affect the size of the discount?
Yes, but much less than we expected. And I think that my understanding of this result is that it's not really a quid pro quo. I think no serious academic will say, I sell my data for $10,000. I think first of all, we're better than that. But second, you're not even past the IQ test. And so it's like really, really a stupid idea. However, there are a lot of ways to influence your outcome. And sometimes it's just wishful thinking or rational justification. And so if you have a grant from a particular institution, if you are hired by a particular institution, you see that institution in a different way. And so the amount of money is not that important, is the relationship which is important.
Okay, and you've talked a lot about economics, but we started off talking about medicine. Is there a difference there? Like, do you think that economics is less conflicted than medicine?
I think that historically, much less so. Prospectively, we are converging, because the biggest source of conflict in medicine is that all this clinical trial are extremely expensive. And so you cannot do them without funding by the private sector. And the private sector has a big interest at stake. And I think in economics we're going in the same direction, because there are these big companies that have a lot of data, but also a lot of interest with it. And so it is difficult these days for a researcher to do empirical work using publicly available sources, also because competition is so intense. And so the edge that privileged access to a very peculiar data set give you is really, really big. And so as a result, these companies are smart. They dwindle in front of you that price, and you're willing to sort of do a lot.
Okay, and so you think that disclosure just doesn't work?
I think disclosure is not enough to fix the problem. Is the first step. The second is awareness and discounting the papers.
Okay, and then you talked about your other solutions. The journals should just not accept the papers, or we should have these lockers where we put the data in. Any other solutions, do you think?
I think a little bit more enforcement on disclosure, because one of the most interesting results is we ask economists, do you think that you have disclosed your conflict properly? And the vast majority said yes. And then we said, do you think that your colleagues disclose the stuff properly? And the vast majority said no. So clearly, we don't trust our own colleagues to disclose properly. And the reason is that nobody has been sanctioned, basically, for not disclosing a conflict.
Right.
And so, and it's so difficult to even identify that people can get away. And sometimes it's simply that people, I'm not necessarily assuming always bad will or evilness, it's simply they forget, etc. But if there is not a strong incentive to be right, people tend not to be right. And this is economics 101. And so I think the point we are raising in the paper is that this creates an externality, because you can say, I don't care whether you disclose or not. I disclose my conflict, and people will trust me. However, if there is no guarantee that my disclosure is sanctioned, people don't trust them. And so they pull together your paper and my paper. And as a result, there is no sort of separation. And so the conflicting papers are undermining the trust in the non-conflicted ones, which is terrible. And so we want a separation between the two.
Okay. Well, Luigi, I want to disclose that you've got your own podcast, Capitalism, of course, which we at Chicago Booth Review help produce. So I encourage our listeners to go and listen to that. But for the moment, thank you very much for coming on the Chicago Booth Review podcast.
My pleasure.
That's it for this episode of the Chicago Booth Review podcast, which was produced by Josh Stunkel. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and please visit us online at chicagobooth.edu/review. Until next time, I'm Hal Weitzman. Thanks for watching this episode of the Chicago Booth Review podcast.